There were three of us who organized this event tonight, Ivers, myself, and the third is Dana Richards, who is a computer science professor at George Mason. And Dana knows Martin and everything about Martin more than I can even understand or explain.
A dedicated correspondent, but I'm one of the people who was lucky enough to meet him and get to know him fairly well. He, in 1979, discovered I was interested in collecting what he'd written. And when he discovered that, I actually really wanted to read everything he'd written. He couldn't wrap his head around that for a while. So I now have everything he's written. And you can see some stuff over there. I have high school poetry. I have pamphlets under pseudonyms. I have his high school and college yearbook and stuff like that. So that's some just weird stuff over there to indicate the depth of my addiction. But as a result of collecting all of this stuff, I became so familiar with his life that everybody's assumed I would write his biography. And that is now my goal, is to write his biography in the coming months. And as a result, I've been looking through lots of interviews and stuff like that. Now, as a result also of that, I was asked to write an article for a little magazine called the Friends of Sherlock Holmes. They called me up and said, could you write an article about Gardner and Sherlock Holmes? Now, since Gardner's never actually written a book about Sherlock Holmes, one of the very few things he hasn't written a book about, and hopefully you all noticed that slideshow that was up over there. That was books from my collection, and there's 341 slides in that show. So there were a lot of books. But none of them were about Sherlock Holmes. So I had to work kind of hard to write an article about Holmes and Sherlock Holmes and Martin Gardner. Well, it turns out there is a lot to say. I have a nice slideshow too.
Give us 1 minute.
But before we get to that, let me get started and say what I can tell you. He, of course, you can do the math, was born in 1914, Tulsa. He grew up in Tulsa. He had a very good background. Tulsa was a good place to be, especially if your father was a wildcatter. And so he was able to indulge almost anything he wanted. For example, he did have a fine collection of puzzles when he grew up. And I asked which ones did he have, and he said he had them all. Okay, because any puzzle he wanted, he got. So he had thousands of mechanical puzzles. That's what his first collection was, of mechanical puzzles. We're getting closer here. All right, now we can see something. This is good. We couldn't see anything before. There we go.
Would you prefer the PowerPoint?
Let's go for PDF if it works. The PowerPoint. No, excuse me. The PowerPoint. The PDF is a backup.
Is it MG and Sherlock?
That's it. Okay, good. We're in business. So, now, he has written some memoirs which are unpublished, and let me quote from that. He says here, one day in English, my teacher asked everyone in class to say what book they had most enjoyed in the past few months. She expected us to name such novels as Ivanhoe or Vanity Fair. But when it came my turn, I said, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Everyone in the class tittered except for the teacher, who had a pained look on her face. So, slideshow and we're in business. All right, thank you. Now, Tulsa, I'll just say a couple things about Tulsa. First off, Tulsa in 1895 had horses tied up on the street. It was a nothing town. By 1915, it was coming along pretty well. When he was born in 1914, you recall. And by 1928, it was a metropolis. Okay, so this was not your typical Midwestern town. There was money in Tulsa. There were opportunities in Tulsa. Okay, so the high school had teachers which had PhDs and masters. Okay, it was not a normal experience that we would expect. So we had a very strong academic background from the very start. Now, that's his house. It's not a small place. And I you can't see anything here, unfortunately. This is going to be bad. This is this tennis court out back. And the reason the tennis court, I'll tell you why in a moment, the tennis court's important. Okay, now in 1926, he gave an interview to the newspaper. This gets really good for biographers. When a 12-year-old gets an interview in the newspaper and you get 5 inches of copy. In this, he's number 6 there. In this, he lists all his influences. He was big on Tom Mix and things like that, as you might expect. But he lists proudly in this interview that Sherlock Holmes was one of his favorite authors and so forth. So we have it from an early point, all right? So this is good. I'm on the right track. Now this is the high school. Again, not a shabby high school, and I've already read the quote that goes with that picture. Now, I'm going to talk about a guy named John Bennett Shaw. Now, John Bennett Shaw did not go to Tulsa Central, but he went to a Catholic school in the same town. They became very good friends, and no one knows why, but it's pretty obvious why, because he played on the varsity tennis team. And Gardner was one of the few people who had a tennis court on their property. So, everybody who liked tennis hung out at the Gardners. So he became very good friends with John Bennett Shaw. Now, John Bennett Shaw went on to be the foremost collector of Sherlock Holmes in the world. No one else is close. Okay? Now, his collection had 20,000 volumes in it. All right? He also was the foremost collector of G.K. Chesterton in the world. There was nothing written by G.K. Chesterton that he did not have, and he gave all of those to Notre Dame. He gave all of his Sherlock Holmes to the University of Minnesota Library, who are the people who asked me to write this article. So John Bennett Shaw is part of this picture, and Gardner wrote articles about John Bennett Shaw. This is an article he wrote in 1947. He wrote several other articles about John Bennett Shaw. Lifelong friend, described him as best friend until his death. So, he has this long relationship with this, Sherlock Holmes. Where did the Sherlock Holmes come from? Well, there's an interesting story there. In 1937, after they both graduated from college, actually, Shaw graduated from Notre Dame, and Gardner had just quit school. After getting his bachelor's, he went to seminary, yes, seminary. He went to seminary for a year and quit. So they were spending the year 1937, summer, not knowing what to do, so they decided to do directed reading. So they decided to pick an author every week or two and study that author. This is what they did in the summer. All right. So they picked various people. Now, one person they picked was G.K. Chesterton that summer, and the other person they picked was Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle was suggested by Gardner. Of course, G.K. Chesterton was suggested by Shaw. Now, Vincent Sterrett, some people may know him because he was the editor, book editor for Saturday Review of Literature for many, many years. He wrote a year before they had this reading program, he wrote The Private